Well, I don't think very much about welfare. That's a different matter. In my paper, I talked about happiness, but welfare, well-being, is a different matter because it's internal. But welfare is more viewed as what the state gives to individuals, particularly those who aren't working, and that's an important part of happiness within the socio-political arena, but I don't have thoughts about that in my paper. I think it's profoundly dangerous for societies to think about elevating the happiness of their members through interfering with the psychological states of their members. If societies want to improve well-being by improving the objective indicators of well-being, for example, levels of education, life expectancy, infant mortality, and many, many other measures, lessening the inequality in society and so on, that's great. But one point I wanted to make in my talk is that it's profoundly dangerous for societies to deal with the inside of people's heads. I always worry, because most of the presentations we're hearing assume that governments are benevolent. Mostly they are. However, there is a malevolent side to governments too. They can sometimes not simply try to benefit their citizens, but also to manipulate their citizens. And many social scientists have theorized about this, and I think it's important to bear in mind. So that for social scientists dealing with happiness and well-being, this too has to be remembered. For example, if North Korea were trying to raise its citizens' happiness levels, I think we would have good reason to be suspicious. We're probably less so with liberal democracies like Denmark, as has been discussed today, but still we should always be a little suspicious. Some of the presentations today talked about this in terms of advertising. You know, when you've got Coca-Cola trying to make you believe that if you drink Coca-Cola you will be a happier person. Well, we're being manipulated. And we've got to be aware of this manipulation, and also I think all the presenters here have to be aware of the possibility that what they find will indeed be used to manipulate people. Now, I don't mean to sound paranoid here. I realize that is unlikely to happen with many of these presentations, but still we need to be aware of this. I think the first skill would be for all social scientists dealing with well-being and happiness to realize that it's a double-edged sword. We can't simply assume, oh, happiness, great. The more happy we are, the better. Well, no. Not necessarily true, because the shadow of Huxley's novel Brave New World lies over us. And the same thing is true with The Matrix and many, many other mass media presentations we've seen that show how people may be happy, but they're happy on the basis of false consciousness, of not understanding what's really happening to them in their lives. And that can be profoundly dangerous. Now, again, I'm not saying we need to be profoundly paranoid over this, because I realize that most of the governments being discussed here are benevolent governments, but we always need to be aware of that possibility. And the last thing that I brought up in my talk is happiness is not the highest human value. What is the highest human value? Well, I think it's something like authenticity, something like seeing things clearly. I would much rather be able to see things clearly and be unhappy than I would to be profoundly happy and yet to be blind to what's really going on. So that's the value that I'm placing here. I think we all need to be aware of this. First of all, gross national happiness is a term coming out of Bhutan. It seems to be a valid term, but how much of this is used as a marketing device, I don't know. I mean, no disrespect to Bhutanese thinkers who are coming here, fine, but we don't know how happy Bhutan may or may not be. So let's talk instead about how to integrate the happiness of a society with its gross domestic product, with its economic growth. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that beyond a certain point, economic growth does not lead to greater happiness. What is the recipe for greater happiness? In a liberal sense, what it is, of course, as we know from Northern Europe and many of the societies that come out highest in the happiest ratings, it is having governments that do take in high levels of taxation, but also really do help their citizens. And the citizens trust the government. In places like Denmark and Holland, most citizens do. In many other societies, including, I guess, Mexico today, from what I've heard, many people don't. In Hong Kong, people don't trust the Chinese government. So that's always the issue. If you cannot trust the government, then the government's efforts to promote happiness are likely to be ineffective unless they are the kind of external matters. Nobody would object against having a better life expectancy. But when it comes to the government actually getting and manipulating minds, that's propaganda. That's what we do not want to see. That's blinding us. To go back to the earlier point I was making in this regard to this question, the key is somehow citizens have to trust the government. But how can that be created? It's like what one of the presentations that I was listening to was talking about, trust. How do you establish greater trust between people? How do you have trust of the individual to the government? One famous example from China that I think about is Lei Feng, who was the hero of Maoist China, for always sacrificing himself to other people. He seems like Jesus Christ. However, Lei Feng was in fact following Chairman Mao, and at the time that Lei Feng was sacrificing himself to the government, Chairman Mao had his 10 mistresses, Chairman Mao had his rather cushy life, so that was a matter of his being manipulated. How then can a government inspire trust in its citizens and not inspire cynicism? Well, the government has to be a damn good government, that's one thing, and people too have to be able to believe. What we see in many societies, including the United States, is this progressive loss in trust in the government. And that's a very terrible thing. Part of the answer might be that in societies like Denmark and Holland, they're relatively small. And so as a result, the government is not trying to promote its citizens to engage in war with other countries. No, it's relatively small and people can see what the government's trying to do. In larger countries, there's much more room for cynicism because is the government looking out for its citizens' best interests? There's good reasons to think not to. One idea that would be important to remember in happiness research is Marx's notion of false consciousness. Because what is happiness no more than false consciousness? I don't think so. I think there's real happiness, but that idea is worth considering. And I don't hear too many papers talking about that, but it is worth keeping in mind. Okay, I can't say exactly because it's still early in the first day of the conference, or midday in the first day of the conference. First of all, it's wonderful that it's taking place, because governments do need to think about this. I applaud the government of Jalisco for thinking about this. Secondly, we all need to be more cautious than we've been about the fact that happiness, number one, may not be an unalloyed good, and number two, we need to be skeptical about where this research is taking us. Now, ultimately, it's for the good. I believe in happiness. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. I don't mean to be a cynic about this. But we need to do this with our eyes wide open instead of our eyes half shut. We need to be aware of all of the dangers that I've been describing in talking to you. And once we do that, I think happiness research can be beneficial because already happiness research has shown us some important things. And you see this daily and weekly in the mass media. Don't spend your money on things, spend it on experience, and so on and so on and so on. Be with other people rather than be lost in your own nice hotel room, and so on. We see that. There are these lessons that make people happier, and if people know about it, it will be much, much better. At a purely innocent level, knowing about happiness is like knowing about nutrition. You'll have a better life if you know this stuff. Still, because capitalism and because governments do want to manipulate people, we also have to always stay well aware of this. I've mentioned governments here, but I think capitalism probably is the worst example of clearly entities that want to use us to cause us to spend more money for their interests, but not for our interests. I've wondered, in Hong Kong, when you go to McDonald's, sometimes the people picking up trash are mentally handicapped. And I wondered, they look so happy when they're doing it. And I've wondered, maybe the key to happiness is for us all to be mentally handicapped. That's too cynical. I don't believe that stuff. But still, that's possible that something like that is the case. Does education help people make people more happy? Not necessarily. But the ideal, the dream, is still for happiness to come about not from a lack of awareness, but from a full awareness. Can happiness work out that way? That's certainly the dream. And I think it's possible that dream can come true. That's the ideal I think we all have to have. I think this kind of education into happiness is a very good thing rather than a bad thing. And I think if more people knew this, if more people were generally better educated, we would indeed have more happiness. And you see some statistical evidence for this. I know in the United States, for example, the less educated a couple is, the more likely they are to divorce. And I think that's probably because of the degree of awareness that education brings people that causes them to make life choices that are better for them, and that probably leads to happiness. This is an overgeneralization, but that's true to a degree. So it's not that education is a negative thing necessarily, but we also need to be aware that education doesn't necessarily lead to happiness, but the ultimate value is knowing what's going on, being aware of things, being authentic, rather than happiness itself. If happiness comes, terrific. That's a wonderful byproduct. The key to pursue happiness is not to pursue happiness. It's really true in a sense that the less you think about it, the better. C.P. Snow once talked about this. He said, the more you look for happiness, the more likely it is you'll never find it. And you could see how, I can't speak at a state level, but at an individual level, if you're always thinking, am I happy? Am I happy or not? Am I happy? How can I become happy? Where can I find it? No, for me, happiness comes sometimes, just sort of something pops into my head. Wow, this is neat. Wow, I'm happy. And then it goes away. You can't be self-conscious about this stuff. That's what real happiness is. I don't experience happiness that often. I'm hardly saying I'm a model, but that's what happens when it takes place. And that may be generally true. Happiness is a byproduct. So rather than directly push happiness, it comes. Now, I don't mean to be denigrating the research that we're seeing presented here. This is wonderful that it's being done. But ultimately, happiness may be a very curious matter because it's better not to think about it.